I got a problem with meatball subs. Oftentimes when I'm digging into a beautiful meatball sub, the meatballs won't stay in it. Well, it turns out we've all been making meatball sandwiches wrong. And I did not know until I found the Naples street food Cuzzetiello, the original meatball sub that solves this small but pesky problem. Because when was the last time you saw somebody eat a meatball sandwich with one hand? So if that sounds good for you, hit the like and subscribe button, leave a comment down below. That's the best way to support me in this channel. If you like the work I'm doing, helps out YouTube a lot. So what we're gonna be stewing the meatballs in is basically my weekday sauce. We take a good 24-ounce can of whole peeled tomatoes. These Bianco di Naples are my favorite. And I'm just gonna run these tomatoes through my food mill. The food mill just kind of breaks down the tomatoes into the perfect texture, removing any seeds and any unwanted pulp. You can use an immersion blender or a food processor. Just make sure you don't whip too much air into the tomatoes and sort of lighten that beautiful red that's inherent in the tomatoes. So we've got our tomatoes pureed. Need a little bit of garlic. Now I'm in my real lazy summer phase. So I'm not even gonna slice the garlic. I'm just gonna cut it into like slivers. So I'm just gonna cut it in half, just with the paper on. Paper should just come off nice and easy. Cut the root end off and just cut it into little slivers. It's gonna give all that same beautiful garlic flavor. Just something I like to do when I'm feeling lazy. And I've been feeling lazy for months. And then I just have a little bit of a basil stem off some basil that I harvested from my plant. That's gonna go in as well and infuse this oil. So we'll take all those ingredients over to the stove, and in a high-rimmed pan or a saucier on medium-high heat, coat the bottom of the pan with some olive oil and then toss in the garlic and the basil. And we wanna cook the garlic and the basil until the garlic begins to brown and that garlic and basil flavor infuses the oil. And then we're gonna add the tomatoes, but before we do, we're gonna lower the heat a little bit to minimize any reaction. And once the tomatoes are in, we can season it with salt and just let it cook gently while we make our meatballs. Now to make this, we need some good Italian bread. And traditionally in Naples, they use a bread called caffone, which is sort of just like a crusty peasant bread. And what they do is they cut the butt of the sandwich, the culo, and they make the sandwich within that. So we're gonna cut that off. Whatever size you want, whatever works for you. So then what I'm gonna do is cut out the middle and then hollow it out. And now we're gonna take the guts of that bread, we're just gonna tear it up, and we're gonna turn this into a panade, which is basically what we do with breadcrumbs and all the liquid ingredients in meatballs. This is just the way you would do things before you would have breadcrumbs laying around the pantry. To me, I don't ever see a difference between using bread and breadcrumbs. And the reason I use breadcrumbs mostly is because I rarely ever have fresh bread around the house. It's no good for the waistline. I just need like a handful. And then you see what you're left with? You're left with something that is a completely encased vessel for meatballs. The meatball won't come flying out, the sauce won't come dripping out and burn your hands. It is the way meatballs should be served. And because it's the butt, that sauce and everything that's in there is going to withstand it. It's hard, but that sauce will soften it from the inside and be beautiful. To that, I'm gonna add just a couple tablespoons of heavy cream. I've got about an equal amount of this tomato sauce that I've just pulled out. I'm gonna add that in as well. Then I'm gonna take 2 cloves of garlic and grate that in with a microplane directly into the bowl. I'm gonna take a little parsley and we're gonna roughly chop that up. And then some salt. And then some pecorino romano. And I go generous with it. To me, when it comes to meatballs, it's always pecorino romano. You can throw Parmigiano on top, but because of that salty sharpness inside of the meatballs, it really goes a long way in flavoring it just a little bit better than I think Parmesan. And now we go in and we kind of mix this up to create a slushy akin to how we would normally do when we make meatballs. This is gonna be what flavors the meatballs. And just by smelling it, you can smell the flavor without even having to taste it. And there's no egg in there, so you can taste it. It should almost be saltier than you want and have a ton of flavor because that's gonna be what flavors the meat. So now in a bowl, a large bowl, we can add our meats to it. Now, if you're lucky and you live in an Italian-American area, they will sell you a package of fresh ground pork, fresh ground beef, and fresh ground veal in sort of a meatball mix. And that is the way to go. Generally, my meatball recipes don't include the mix because it's harder to find. So I want you to feel like you can make a good meatball with just beef. But if you want the best meatball, get the 3. And go ahead and we're gonna add 2 eggs to it. And sort of the benefit of the blend is that the beef is a nice base, the pork adds great flavor, and the veal brings the tenderness. And I like to add the egg directly to the meat and not the slurry, just to make sure that the meat gets completely coated in all that egg. For me, the secret to making meatballs is making sure that flavor gets incorporated throughout every inch of all of that meat. I feel like sometimes when you add everything at once, you just get bare spots of the meatball that don't get the flavoring. So once we get that mixed up, we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna add in our slurry. And then we mix that in together as well. So next up, we can take our meat and form them into balls. And you can do big balls, small balls, whatever you like. I like to lean on the smaller side, not totally uniform. Maybe some are a little bigger than others. Just big enough to be able to stuff that bread without having to squash the meatballs to get them to fit in. So I just have a little water next to here, and I'm gonna dip my hands in, form little balls, and then get them onto a sheet tray. Now we can fry the meatballs. In a nonstick pan over medium-high heat, add enough extra virgin olive oil to coat the pan by about an inch. Bring it up to temperature, and then we can begin to add the meatballs in a circle so that we can keep track of which ball to flip first. And you want to make sure that you do not overcrowd the pan. Once that side is browned, flip the meatballs in the order that they were placed and brown the next side. If there's a large third side of the meatball that isn't brown, just let that get some time in the oil to brown. And once they're all browned, take them out of the pan and drop them into the sauce. If you've got more meatballs, go ahead and brown those exactly the same until all the meatballs are in the pot of sauce. That sauce is now a great consistency, but we need to thin it out a bit to compensate for the cooking time. So I'm gonna fill that can of tomatoes up about halfway with water and then add some of that into the pot to thin it out slightly. Then place a lid on the pot, turn the heat down to low, and cook covered for 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, the meatball should be nice and tender and that sauce should be thickened. If the sauce is runny, let it cook more until it's not. But I know it's right by how the sauce clings to some bread. Then we can turn the heat off, meatballs are done. Now we're ready to assemble. We're gonna take that hollowed out piece of bread, and the first thing we're gonna do is spoon in some of our sauce straight into that hole. And then we can take a meatball and just plop it in. Push it all the way down and just add in as many as it'll take. About halfway through, I'm gonna just add a little bit more sauce to keep everything nice and saucy, and then keep adding meatballs, and then a final addition of sauce at the top. Then I'm gonna place some tiny leaves of basil and then finish with some Parmigiano Reggiano. I'll never eat a meatball sandwich another way again. And it's not just meatballs. You can throw meatballs and sausage. You can throw meatballs and broccoli rabe. You can throw roast pork in. Use the butt of the bread. Because when was the last time you saw somebody eat a meatball sandwich with one hand? This is the way. The recipe is gonna be down in the description. That's all that I have today. I'll see you next time. Until then, take care of yourself and go feed yourself.